My name is Sofia Martinez, and I'm writing this from my apartment in Los Angeles, where I live alone at 26 because my undocumented parents were deported to Mexico 3 years ago after living in the United States for 20 years, tearing apart the only family I've ever known and validating every fear that consumed my entire childhood as the U.S. citizen daughter of immigrants who lived every single day knowing that one traffic stop, one workplace raid, or one vindictive neighbor could destroy everything we had built. I was born in a hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, making me an American citizen by birth. But that constitutional right meant nothing when ICE agents arrested my parents during a routine traffic stop and initiated deportation proceedings that no amount of legal advocacy could stop, leaving me orphaned in my own country. While my parents live in a Mexican city they barely remember after spending their entire adult lives in America. The divided reality of my childhood began from my earliest memories, before I even understood what undocumented meant or why my parents became terrified whenever they saw police cars or government officials. I was born into a family where my citizenship status created a fundamental divide. I had rights, protections, and opportunities that my parents would never have, making me simultaneously the most vulnerable member of the family as a child, and the most powerful one as the only person with legal status who could interact with institutions without fear of deportation. The translator burden started when I was 6 years old, and my English became fluent enough to interpret between my Spanish-speaking parents and the English-speaking world of doctors, teachers, landlords, bill collectors, and government officials who controlled every aspect of our lives. What should have been a normal childhood developmental milestone, becoming bilingual, transformed into an exhausting adult responsibility where my language skills made me essential to my family's survival in ways that created psychological pressure no 6-year-old should have to carry. The medical interpreter role was the most terrifying because the stakes were literally life and death. At age 8, I sat in examination rooms translating my mother's symptoms to doctors who spoke impatiently and used medical terminology I barely understood, knowing that any mistake in translation could result in misdiagnosis or improper treatment. When my mother had a pregnancy scare that required emergency room care, I was the one explaining her medical history, her allergies, her pain levels, while nurses looked at me with confusion about why an 8-year-old was serving as the medical interpreter for her own mother. The financial responsibilities escalated as I became the family member who could safely interact with banks, utility companies, and government offices that required documentation my parents couldn't provide. By age 10, I was calling to negotiate payment plans when we couldn't afford rent, explaining late fees on electricity bills, and handling bureaucratic interactions that required me to sound adult and authoritative enough to be taken seriously despite being a child who should have been playing with friends after school instead of managing my family's economic survival. The school-parent mediation became my responsibility because my parents' limited English and fear of institutions meant they couldn't attend parent-teacher conferences, school meetings, or advocate for my educational needs without me serving as both translator and intermediary. I would sit in conferences explaining my own academic performance and behavioral issues to teachers while simultaneously translating their concerns to my anxious parents who desperately wanted me to succeed in school but couldn't navigate the American education system without my help. The constant vigilance consumed every moment of my childhood as I learned to scan for ICE vehicles, recognize plainclothes immigration officers, and identify situations that might expose my parents' undocumented status. I developed hypervigilance and anxiety that made me constantly aware of potential threats. Was that car following us? Was that person asking too many questions? Should we avoid this neighborhood where immigration raids had occurred? The fear became so pervasive that I couldn't relax even during supposedly fun activities because I was always watching, always protecting, always terrified. The traffic stop terror escalated whenever my parents had to drive, which was necessary for work, but also the most common situation where undocumented immigrants encountered law enforcement. Every time my father drove me to school or my mother took me to the doctor, I sat in the back seat with my heart racing, watching for police cars and praying we wouldn't get pulled over. The few times we were stopped for minor traffic violations became traumatic experiences where I watched my parents' hands shake as they provided the fake driver's licenses they had purchased because getting real ones was impossible without legal status. The adult decisions I had to make by age 12 included advising my parents about which jobs to take based on which employers seemed less likely to verify immigration status, which neighborhoods to avoid because of IC activity, and whether specific situations posed too much risk of detection. These weren't decisions a child should have been making, but my English fluency, understanding of American systems, and legal citizenship status made me the family member best positioned to assess risks and make strategic choices about our survival. The friend embarrassment was constant because I could never have normal childhood experiences like sleepovers, birthday parties, or play dates without complicated explanations about why my parents couldn't be contacted at work, why we didn't have certain types of documentation, or why we lived in constant fear that I couldn't explain to classmates whose biggest worry was getting good grades or making the soccer team. I became skilled at deflecting questions and creating cover stories that would protect my family's secret while also isolating me from normal peer relationships. The parentification was complete by middle school when I realized that I had essentially become my parents' parent, making decisions about their lives, protecting them from danger, managing their interactions with the outside world, and carrying emotional burdens that should have flowed in the opposite direction. Instead of my parents providing stability and security for me, I was providing those things for them, creating a fundamental role reversal that violated basic childhood developmental needs. The education sacrifice happened because my parents desperately wanted me to succeed academically as the family's hope for upward mobility, but my family responsibilities consumed time and energy that should have been devoted to homework, studying, and extracurricular activities. I would stay up until midnight finishing homework after spending the evening translating documents, making phone calls, and handling adult responsibilities, competing academically with peers who had parents who could support their education rather than requiring their children to support the family's basic survival. The college guilt was overwhelming when I received acceptance to UC Berkeley, knowing that my parents had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they couldn't access, but also knowing that leaving for college would remove the one family member who could safely navigate the world on their behalf. The decision to attend college felt like abandoning my parents when they needed me most, but staying home to protect them felt like betraying the sacrifices they had made to provide educational opportunities one was supposed to pursue. The deportation nightmare started in elementary school and never stopped. Recurring dreams where IC agents burst into our home, arrested my parents, and I was left alone screaming for them while they were dragged away. The nightmares were so vivid and frequent that I developed insomnia because I was afraid to fall asleep and experience the terror again, creating chronic sleep deprivation that affected my school performance and mental health throughout my childhood and adolescence. The political trauma intensified during election cycles when immigration became a political football, and I had to watch news coverage of politicians calling people like my parents criminals, illegals, and threats to American society, hearing my family's humanity debated as if they were abstract policy problems rather than real people who worked hard, paid taxes, raised an American citizen daughter, and contributed to their communities despite living in constant fear. The identity confusion was profound because I was legally American but culturally raised in a Mexican household by parents who maintained close connections to their homeland despite physical distance. I felt fully American when I was at school with my classmates, but when I came home I entered a different world where Spanish was the primary language, Mexican traditions were observed, and the American dream felt like a cruel joke because my family could never access it despite my birthright citizenship. The breaking point came during my sophomore year at Berkeley when I received a phone call from my younger brother, also a U.S. citizen, saying that our parents had been arrested during a traffic stop and were being held by IC pending deportation proceedings. I immediately dropped everything, drove back to Phoenix, and spent the next 6 months trying to fight the deportation while also trying to keep my family from falling apart financially and emotionally as we faced the reality that my worst childhood fear was actually happening. The legal battle was futile despite spending every penny of savings and going into debt to hire immigration attorneys who worked tirelessly but ultimately couldn't overcome the fact that my parents had no legal pathway to stay in the country after living here for nearly 3 decades. The deportation hearing felt like a formality where the judge acknowledged my parents' positive contributions, their U.S. citizen children, their deep community ties, but ultimately ruled that the law provided no relief and they would be removed from the country within 30 days. The family separation trauma of watching my parents board a plane to Mexico, a country they hadn't seen in 28 years, and where they had no support system, job prospects, or connection to current society, was the most devastating experience of my life. My father cried as he hugged me goodbye, apologizing for being undocumented, for putting me through years of fear and responsibility, for leaving me and my brother orphaned in America despite doing everything they could to provide us with opportunities they never had. The survivor guilt that followed their deportation was crushing because I remained in America with my citizenship rights intact, while my parents were essentially exiled to a country they barely knew, separated from their children and everything they had built over 3 decades of hard work and sacrifice. I had been born on the right side of an invisible line that determined who deserved to stay and who had to leave, and that geographical accident of birth felt increasingly arbitrary and cruel as I watched my parents struggle to rebuild lives in Mexico while I continued my American life without them. The mental health crisis that emerged from decades of childhood trauma and the ultimate realization of my worst fears included complex PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and attachment issues related to the constant threat of family separation that had defined my entire developmental period. I finally sought therapy 3 years after my parents' deportation when I realized that I had spent my entire life in survival mode and had never actually processed the accumulated trauma of growing up as a citizen child with undocumented parents. The therapy that began during my crisis was with Dr. Elena Gutierrez, a Latina psychologist who specialized in treating immigration-related trauma and mixed-status family stress. She helped me understand that my childhood had been stolen by an immigration system that created impossible situations for families and forced children to carry adult responsibilities while living in constant fear, and that the psychological damage was profound and legitimate even though I had survived and appeared successful on the surface. Growing up as a U.S. citizen child with undocumented parents creates a unique form of developmental trauma that mainstream psychology often fails to recognize, Dr. Gutierrez explained during one of our sessions. You experienced chronic stress, role reversal, parentification, constant hypervigilance, and the threat of catastrophic family separation throughout your entire childhood. Those aren't just difficult circumstances. They're adverse childhood experiences that fundamentally alter brain development and create lasting psychological impacts that require specific treatment and validation. She helped me understand that the translator burden, financial responsibilities, and adult decision-making I had carried throughout childhood represented forms of parentification that violated basic developmental needs for security, protection, and age-appropriate responsibilities. Children need to be children, not family protectors and survival managers, and the role reversal I experienced had created attachment issues, anxiety disorders, and difficulty trusting that I deserve care rather than always being the caretaker. The grief work involved mourning the childhood I never had, the carefree play, the parental protection, the freedom from adult responsibilities, the sense of security that my peers took for granted while I was constantly terrified that my family could be destroyed at any moment. Dr. Gutierrez helped me process the anger at an immigration system that punished children for their parents' undocumented status despite those children being American citizens with constitutional rights that meant nothing when family separation was treated as acceptable collateral damage. The advocacy development began as I connected with organizations like United We Dream and the National Immigration Law Center, where I discovered thousands of other citizen children who had grown up in mixed-status families and experienced similar trauma. The collective advocacy provided validation that my experiences weren't unique or exaggerated, and the organized movement created opportunities to channel my pain into systematic change that could prevent other children from growing up in the same fear that had defined my life. The storytelling work that emerged from my healing includes sharing my experience publicly through immigration advocacy organizations, media interviews, and congressional testimony about how current immigration policies harm American citizen children despite rhetoric claiming to protect American families. I share my story to humanize the statistics about mixed-status families and help policymakers understand that their immigration decisions don't just affect undocumented adults. They devastate American citizen children who are supposedly the future these politicians claim to care about. The policy advocacy includes working on legislative reforms like the American Families United Act that would prevent the deportation of parents of U.S. citizen children except in cases involving serious criminal convictions. The legislation recognizes that family unity is a fundamental value, and that forcing American citizens to choose between their parents and their country violates basic human rights and creates generations of traumatized children. The research collaboration with child psychologists studying immigration-related trauma helps document the long-term psychological impacts of growing up in mixed-status families. The data shows that citizen children with undocumented parents experience rates of anxiety, depression, and PTSD comparable to children who have experienced war or natural disasters, providing empirical evidence that current immigration policies create public health crises affecting millions of American children. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on supporting other citizen children who are currently living in mixed-status families and need guidance on managing adult responsibilities while also protecting their own mental health and development. I work to help younger men understand that they deserve to be children, that their family situation isn't their fault, and that asking for help isn't betraying their parents but protecting their own well-being so they can be more effective family advocates. Today, I work as an immigration attorney specializing in family-based cases while also coordinating with organizations advocating for immigration reforms that would protect mixed-status families. The career allows me to use my painful personal experience to help other families navigate the same impossible system that destroyed mine, while also working towards systematic change that could prevent future family separations. The cross-border family maintenance includes regular visits to see my parents in Mexico and constant phone calls, where I continue serving as their connection to the American systems they contributed to for decades but can no longer access. The relationship is complicated by the fact that they're my parents, but I'm still functionally taking care of them from across a border, and the role reversal that started in my childhood continues even as an adult. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who specialize in immigration-related trauma helps citizen children process the complex psychological impacts of growing up in mixed-status families. Organizations like United We Dream, the National Immigration Law Center, and Immigrant Families Together provide advocacy resources, legal support, and peer networks for mixed-status families. School-based support programs that recognize and accommodate the unique stressors facing citizen children with undocumented parents help reduce educational impacts of family responsibilities and chronic stress. Mental health services specifically addressing immigration-related trauma provide treatment for the PTSD, anxiety, and depression that commonly affect children growing up under threat of family separation. Legal aid organizations provide representation for families facing deportation and help navigate the complex immigration system that determines family unity or separation. Policy advocacy organizations work on legislative reforms to protect mixed-status families and prevent the deportation of parents of U.S. citizen children. Community support networks connect mixed-status families with resources, including financial assistance, emergency planning for potential IC encounters, and Know Your Rights education. Educational resources help teachers, healthcare providers, and other professionals understand the unique challenges facing citizen children in mixed-status families and provide appropriate support. Today, when I meet other citizen children who are growing up with undocumented parents and carrying the weight of their family survival, I tell them that they deserve to be children, that the burden they're carrying isn't their responsibility, even though circumstances have forced it upon them, and that asking for help isn't betraying their family, but protecting their own development so they can survive the trauma that mixed-status families endure. Being born a citizen doesn't protect you from the devastating impacts of living under constant deportation threat, and healing from that trauma requires acknowledging the profound injustice of an immigration system that treats American citizen children as acceptable casualties in political debates about border security and enforcement. Underscore 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 underscore